Start this morning's presentation, and I'd like to introduce Sally Swenson, who will be your presenter today. Sally?
Thank you, Jason. Good morning. My name is Sally Swenson, and I am an author with the Educational Services Group here in Redlands, California. Joining me today is Jason Cupp, the Metadata Product Specialist. I want to welcome you all to today's live training seminar. Today we'll talk about different ways you can work with metadata. We'll look at what goes on behind the scenes, and we'll explore ways to streamline your metadata workflow. And now we'll begin our first topic. Let's get started by looking at the metadata standards. There are two supported by the ArcGIS editors. ESRI support for FGDC is complete, and development of the ISO standard is still in progress. How do you go about choosing a standard, especially if you're just getting started or have a special project to deliver? If you're already working with one of the standards, there's no compelling reason to change just for the sake of change. If you're working with international applications, then you'll probably want to work with ISO metadata. If you need detailed metadata, regardless of your data or the purpose for the data, FGDC metadata provides more elements than ISO does at this point. But if you're just getting started with metadata and you're learning the process, ISO might work well for you, partly because it has fewer elements for you to populate, and partly because the ISO wizard is easy to navigate. Now that you've decided on a standard, let's make sure we're using the same terminology before we move on. When we talk about metadata, there are two types of elements: elements that are documentation and elements that are properties. Documentation elements are entered via one of the editors. ArcGIS derives properties elements from the data. For example, the number of features in a feature class is a property of the data, and ArcCatalog knows how to extract this information. On the other hand, you need to know what to enter as documentation. If you're just getting started, you can look at metadata documentation for datasets that you already have access to, such as the tutorial data that installs with the software, data and maps media, data from virtual campus courses or instructor-led training, or browse the geography network or other clearinghouses. You'll find samples of metadata in all of these locations. Once you've created metadata, you'll probably begin thinking about how you can save time and reuse the metadata in other data sets. ArcGIS gives you the ability to export and import metadata. In this table, you see an example of all the various export formats. Some formats export metadata in HTML, and anyone with a browser can view these formats. The formats that you see highlighted here are import formats, and these can serve as reusable templates. The XML format in particular can be used for importing and exporting both FGDC and ISO metadata. As you develop your metadata workflow, remember that you can export and import to create templates. And if you're not sure about XML, it's a markup language, something like HTML. On the previous slides, you saw that metadata can be exported to an XML file. Many organizations have specific metadata information that they want included in the metadata. This information might include an abstract, perhaps some legal constraints, even the name and contact information for the metadata author. you might consider creating a collection of templates that contain this information so you can reuse it. Once you export XML metadata to a file and store it on disk, you've devised a handy way to create reusable information. When metadata is stored in a standalone file like this, you don't need to be concerned with metadata properties because there are none associated with metadata in this format. Another part of your workflow will concern how and when you do want to update metadata properties. And this process of updating properties from the data is called synchronization. In other words, the metadata is synchronized with the data. You have a number of opportunities for managing when these updates occur. You can choose to synchronize automatically every time that you view the metadata, and this is the default. Or you can choose to update manually and update whenever you want by clicking the Create Update Metadata button that appears on the metadata toolbar. You can also choose whether to update when you import metadata from a file. If you disable automatic updating when you import, the properties will not initially be updated with information about the receiving dataset. And you might want to do this in order to review the metadata documentation without having to read through the properties. Or you can even choose to turn updates off completely. And even manually updating will not override synchronization once you've turned it completely off. To control updating, you'd use the Customize dialog to add the Set Working Synchronizers button to the metadata toolbar. By default, all of the synchronizers, and there's one for FGDC, for the Geography Network, and for ISO. So again, by default, all of the synchronizers are initially turned on. When you turn one or more of them off, the metadata will not update when you view the metadata, and it won't update when you use the Create Update button. Well, let's think a minute. Why would you want to turn off synchronization? Your organization may have chosen the ISO standard and doesn't want any FGDC elements. By default, both FGDC and ISO will be stored in the same XML. So if you turn off synchronization of FGDC metadata, you assure that no FGDC metadata properties will be included with your ISO metadata. This reduces clutter, but it also eliminates confusion for a user who inadvertently chooses one of the FGDC style sheets to view the metadata. Well, you now know that you can export and import to reuse metadata, but we've only touched briefly on creating metadata documentation, and this is really the foundation for any templates that you create. Is there anything in particular that you need to be aware of when editing? If you have several different users who create and edit the data, these might be the same people who create and edit the metadata. If multiple users are editing the metadata in the same dataset, only the metadata author who saves last will find that his metadata has been saved. When you're editing the personal geodatabase, consider using Windows permissions to manage who can edit your geodatabase metadata. When you do edit, be aware that some properties can also be edited. The FGDC decimal degree bounding coordinates have element names that display here in blue text. This tells you that these elements can be edited. The green asterisk flags the elements that are automatically updated. It isn't good practice to edit these values because they will not be synchronized with the data if you edit your data and add features beyond the current boundaries. Here you see some ISO metadata for distributing the data. Once again, notice the green asterisks that are associated with the properties that can be updated. In this case, the online location includes a computer name that was updated automatically. For security reasons, you may not want to expose the names of your in-house computers and might want to edit this element to show a more benign reference, such as a website. Then, once you edit the value, it won't automatically be updated again. And you'll know that when you use the style sheet to view your metadata and you see that the element is no longer flagged with an asterisk. Now that we've talked about editing, let's find out how you can get help about the elements, especially if you're just getting started. When you edit FGDC metadata, as you see here, you can click the What's This button in the upper right corner of the window, then click in the element that you're editing. In this case, you see that the Contact Person element is a mandatory text field. And you can also see that there's a definition. It's expecting the name of an individual. In the ISO wizard, the table of contents flags the mandatory elements with an asterisk. Now, although title, I happen to know, is a mandatory element, the omission of an asterisk tells me that the title element has already been populated. Creation date and language, the abstract, metadata author, theme codes, and keywords are all types of elements that are mandatory and that are currently empty. You can use the table of contents to go directly to the elements you want to edit, and as you move through the panels, you'll find leading questions that serve as help. Here you see a question that asks you which theme codes apply to your data. In our first software demonstration, I want to show you how to distinguish properties from documentation, plus how to get some help in the editors. I'll begin in ArcCatalog, and I'll go to a geodatabase that contains several feature classes. Let me click on the Metadata tab, and we're going to view the metadata for one of the aquifer feature classes. I also want to change to the FGDC style sheet, and here in the green area that appears at the top of the metadata, you see what I refer to as quick reference metadata. And some of this metadata is informative, such as the data format of the data, the file or table name, and this matches the name as it appears in the catalog tree. But I also see some metadata that isn't very descriptive. For example, the title by default begins as the name of the data set, and I'd like to enter something more descriptive. Also, a hint tells me that the abstract is currently missing. Let me scroll down and link to the identification information section where we'll find this same information in a more formatted manner. Here we see the reference to the title. It has an asterisk that tells me it will be automatically updated by ArcCatalog. I also see an asterisk next to the file or table name element, and this element will always be updated by ArcCatalog. And I see the abstract, which is a documentation element, and it again contains a hint reminding me that I need to enter some viable metadata. Let me begin by editing using the FGDC editor, and from the Tools menu I'll click the Options button. Then I want to go to the Metadata tab. I make sure that automatic updates are on and that I'll be using the FGDC editor. Let me click OK to close that dialog, and from the Metadata toolbar I can click Edit Metadata. Let me try to position this window so you can get a little bit better look at it. And again, I see the reminder that abstract is required, and I'll click the What's This button, then click in the text box to see that abstract expects a brief summary of the data. It's a mandatory text field. Well, I'm going to enter some metadata by borrowing from a source that I have out of your site where I can copy quickly and paste in the information. So now I've populated abstract, and next I want to update the citation title. So I'll click the Citation tab. Notice that I'm working in the Identification Information section. Once again, I'll click What's This? I'll click in this text box to see that the title expects a name, and I can put a descriptive name here. It's mandatory, and again, it's a text field. Once again, I'll borrow some information that I've stashed out of sight, and I'll paste it in here. Now I can save my metadata and return to the FGDC style sheet view, where I now see my descriptive title, and I see that the abstract has been populated. And let's take another look in the Identification Information section. Here you see the title minus the abstract. So this will no longer be updated automatically by ArcCatalog, and it will be my responsibility to edit it if I want to change it. We'll scroll down a little bit to the abstract, and this is the metadata documentation that I entered. Now, how does this compare with using ISO? Well, let's change to the ISO style sheet, and we see a similar format with some informative metadata in the green header box. I also see a title that by default is the name of the data set. I'd like to edit this. I don't see an abstract, but let's take a look at this metadata in the Resource Identification Information section, where it resides in ISO metadata. And again, I see a title element with a green asterisk, and this tells me that ArcCatalog will update the title element automatically. And if I scroll within this section, I still see no abstract, so I must edit it. I'll open the ISO editor by returning to the Tools Options dialog, and on the Metadata tab, I'll change to the ISO wizard. And when I edit, the ISO wizard appears. Here in the table of contents, I see that the title has no asterisk, but it is mandatory. And when I click on it, this confirms that it contains the default value. The hint tells me it expects a title, and I'll just paste in the same title that I used for FGDC. And now for the abstract, notice that the asterisk tells me it's mandatory, and because the asterisk appears here, I know that abstract is empty. So let me click there, and I'll now enter an abstract, and watch the table of contents as I click the Next button. And now the asterisk disappears. Abstract has been populated. So let me click Finish, and we'll return to the ISO style sheet, where we see the descriptive title and the abstract. And now let's view it again in the Resource Identification Information section. Once again, you see the title with no asterisk associated with it. I'm now responsible for updating this. ArcCatalog won't update it automatically. And for the abstract documentation, my metadata has been entered. In this demonstration, you saw how the style sheets display asterisks to identify the elements that update automatically. And in both of the editors, I showed how you can get help on an element-by-element basis. This concludes the first software demonstration, and now we'll return to the presentation. We began this topic with a discussion of how to choose a metadata standard. You learned where to find samples of metadata documentation, and you found that exporting and importing lets you create templates. You learned how to take charge of updating the metadata properties, and we finished with some tips on getting help with the editors. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Jason.
Thank you, Sally. We have a few questions here. David asks, are there plans to allow for the editing and importing and exporting of metadata using Arc Toolbox? So this idea about having geoprocessing tools for manipulating metadata in ArcGIS. This was recently brought up here by our developers here. This is the first time that we've heard this idea from outside ESRI, and this is something we are considering. So David, if you like, send us your email through the through your form, and maybe we can contact you and get an idea of what your workflow is, so that we can devise some plans for this. Patrick asks, why would my organization invest time into metadata? We have not done so for 15 years. Why should we do it now? So this falls underneath the category metadata. What is it good for? Metadata is good for many things. I think as an organization, one of the things that I think you would want to do is keep track of your assets, and metadata helps you do that. Helps let you keep track of your inventory, what things you have. It helps you categorize the things you have in many different ways. And if you're sharing your data out there to the public at large, metadata helps you carry information along with that, such as descriptions, abstract, a purpose statement, and maybe more importantly, a statement of what the data is intended to be used for. That's very important for legal reasons. And for advertising as well. If your data is for sale, advertising is one way that your metadata can be used too. And also the processing steps that you've done to create your data can also be stored inside the metadata as well. So giving somebody an idea about how the data was made, and what were the steps that were used to create that, and the decisions that were made. So with that, we'll go back to Sally.
Thank you, Jason. I'll take one more question. This is from Jim in Charlotte. How do I know if synchronization is on or off? Well, the best way is just to add the button that I mentioned, Set Working Synchronizers, add it to the metadata toolbar, and you access it from the Customize dialog, and under the commands, it's in the metadata category. Not only is that tool good for turning synchronization off and on, but it will give you the status. And now let's move on to our second topic, where we'll look at metadata from other angles. Imagine for a moment that you've just started ArcCatalog, and recall that on the right-hand side there are 3 tabs: Contents, Preview, and Metadata. By default, ArcCatalog opens to the Contents tab, and to view metadata, you'd click the Metadata tab. But what if your organization wants you or others to be able to scan some metadata quickly, perhaps to identify the author of the metadata for several data sets? Rather than using the Metadata tab, is there a shortcut to finding this information? You may not realize it, but when you use the Contents tab, you are viewing metadata, and by default, you see the name of the data set and its type, plus a thumbnail if one has been created. You can customize the information that displays on the Contents tab by adding some metadata elements via the Tools menu and its Options dialog. And here you can choose the elements, or referred to here as columns, that you can add to the Contents tab. And if you choose some, in addition to the default name and type elements, you can now see other metadata elements such as the author, the publication date, and even the name of the projection. Now, just about any of the objects that you see in the catalog tree can have metadata associated with them. And when you've turned on these additional metadata columns, ArcCatalog tries to find the information. To improve performance, be sure to uncheck these additional metadata elements before you connect to the geography network. Now earlier, when you saw how to add metadata elements to the Contents tab, did you wonder what might be going on behind the scenes? As you can see in the actual dialog, to add a metadata column, you can choose to add the default elements from a drop-down list even after you inadvertently delete one. You can add author, for example, by selecting its caption, and then in the property drop-down list you see XML paths to the elements. This first entry displays the XML path to the author element, and you see other X paths to other columns such as title or the place and theme keywords. Now that you've had a quick glimpse of XML paths on the ArcGIS interface, let's look behind the scenes so you can learn how to locate these paths yourself. Here's how the dialog will look if you want to customize it with FGDC point of contact information. And here is a segment of the XML paths for FGDC metadata, and this is viewed using the XML style sheet. This contact information is under the ID info section that's out of view in this graphic, but you see the way down to the actual name of the contact person. Now on the right side of the graphic, you see comparable ISO XML for point of contact information. Notice that the FGDC metadata element names appear all in lowercase, while ISO element names appear in a mix of lower and uppercase, sometimes referred to as camel caps. Now once again, we're going to take a look at the dialog for adding a custom FGDC element to the Contents tab. Now we see the actual FGDC metadata, so this is a view with the style sheet. And finally, how it will look on the Contents tab. So here is the metadata that we wanted to add, and once we have entered our customizations, we can turn on the elements we want to display by using the Tools Options dialog. How would you add the ISO contact information? In exactly the same way. You'd use the same dialog. You would just enter an ISO XPath, and here's an example using the ISO style sheet of the information that you would be displaying and what the final product looks like on the Contents tab. Now let's explore XML a little bit further, and this time in the context of editing or updating your metadata. Notice the asterisk next to the format name element, and also notice that there are no asterisks associated with the online source information. Here's a view of that same metadata using the XML style sheet, and for the format name, and once again here's the reference to Personal Geodatabase Feature Class, notice the reference to sync equals true. This sync is short for synchronization, and this is what goes on behind the scenes to tell ArcCatalog to update the name of the data's format automatically. Now let's take another look at that online location element. By default, it is a property that is automatically updated, but in this case it has been updated to contain a URL. Because it has been edited, when we look at the XML syntax, we see the name of the element, but we no longer see a reference to sync equals true. This is the signal that ArcCatalog will not update this element again, or at least not until someone edits the metadata and manually restores synchronization. And that particular type of editing needs to be done outside of ArcGIS Desktop. Another way to edit metadata is to begin with an empty XML file. To do that, you can just open a text editor, then paste in the 3 lines that you see here into your Word document. Save the document with a meaningful name and an XML extension. For example, something like vectortemplate.xml. You don't want to use the file name metadata.xml because it has a special purpose, and ArcCatalog will assume that the file contains the metadata for the folder in which it resides. And now we're ready for our second software demonstration, where we'll be looking with XML in 3 completely distinct situations. We'll begin by viewing the same elements that we looked at in the first demonstration. So here we are in our catalog, and once again I want to view the metadata for the aquifer feature class, and this time I want to use the XML style sheet. Now recall from the first demonstration that we looked at the file or table name element, and when we viewed the FGDC metadata, an asterisk appeared next to the element name. Now here is the XML syntax for that file or table name element. So F for file, T for table, file or table name. Here's the name that is the same as the dataset name that appears in the catalog tree. The reference here to sync equals true tells us that this element is still automatically updated by ArcCatalog. Now let's drop down a line and look at the XML for the title element that I edited. So here you see the name of the element, the descriptive title that I entered, but there is no reference to sync equals true. This element will no longer be automatically updated by ArcCatalog, and if I want to make changes, I'll need to enter them myself. Now let's explore a few other elements that will be automatically updated. We'll scroll down to the bounding coordinates, and here you see that they fall under spatial domain, and you see a list of bounding coordinates in decimal degrees and another list in local coordinates. With each of them, you see a reference to sync equals true, and it makes sense that ArcCatalog would know how to update these elements automatically. So in this first part of the demonstration, you saw firsthand that it is sync equals true that tells ArcCatalog which elements to update automatically. For the second part of the demonstration, let's customize the metadata that appears on the Contents tab, and we'll begin by using the name of the contact person. So let's look at how we can identify this metadata, and let me move down to this Points of Interest feature class, and let me begin in the metadata editor. I want to make sure I'm using the FGDC editor, so I'll click OK, and when I click Edit Metadata, the FGDC editor appears, and I want to work in the Identification Information section on the Contact tab, and I can see, I'm kind of in a disabled format, the name that I'm looking for, but let's examine the details to see for certain that we're looking at primary contact person information, and now we see the name and other information associated with the metadata. And we want to watch for the name Lewis Clark. Let me close this editor. And now let's look at the XML, or I'm sorry, at the metadata using the FGDC style sheet. So let me scroll down to the Identification Information section and scroll down below the keywords until we get to point of contact. So here's that contact person primary and the name that we'll be looking for. And finally, let's take a third look, this time at the XML syntax, so I'll know how to construct the path. Now at the top we see a reference to ID info. This is for identification information, and you've seen that a couple of times already. Let me collapse some of this metadata that we want to be able to skip over so that I can get down to point of contact, and it's just down here at the bottom. I'm not looking for address. Let me collapse that. But now we see the reference to point of contact, contact info, contact person primary, and contact person. So this path that I've just stepped through is the one that I want to construct on the Contents tab. And to do that, I need to go to the Tools Options dialog and to the Contents tab, and I'll add a new metadata column, or in essence an element. Put in the point of contact, and rather than type that path, let me copy it and paste it in. And we'll review it. There's ID info, point of contact, contact info, contact person primary, and finally contact person. I'll click OK. It appears in the list. I can check it on, close the dialog, and now when I return to the Contents tab, I see the point of contact for any data set that contains the information, and it will just display as a blank if there is no information. So in the second part, you saw another way to use XML, this time by inserting the XPath to add an element to the Contents tab. And finally, in the third portion of the demonstration, I'll create an empty XML file. Actually, let me leave that up there. And I want to store it in a templates folder. So let me collapse this folder and show you that right now I have no templates. I have a text editor open here. I'm going to enter the 3 lines that you saw during the demonstration, and I want to be sure to do this for XML. It isn't adequate just to create an empty text file and rename it. I'm going to save this in my templates folder as a text document, and this will be for my water quality metadata. I'll save it. Yes. Let me move this window out of the way. I'll refresh the view, and here we see the file. I can view its metadata in XML and in ISO, where some default information appears, and also in FGDC. Now, once again, an advantage of using these files is that you can edit them without worrying about properties. And let me edit this file by opening the FGDC metadata editor, and I'll just enter the same abstract that I've been using before. I'll paste it in and save. And now the abstract appears, the abstract documentation. I see it also in its more formatted manner down here in the identification information section. And I have now created the beginning of a collection of templates to streamline the workflow by eliminating a lot of manual editing. So in this software demonstration, we viewed the metadata using 3 style sheets, FGDC, ISO, and XML. And with the XML style sheets, I showed you how to determine XML paths to an element so you can add that element to the Contents tab. And we concluded with a look at one way to create a reusable template. This concludes the second software demonstration, so let's return to the presentation. Now we have a question for you. I'd like for you to locate the Review question link in the upper left corner of your browser and click this link now. During the presentation, we talked about synchronization. What does synchronization do? Does it update data with information from the metadata? Does it update metadata properties with properties from the data? Does it update metadata documentation with properties from the data? Or does it turn off automatic updates? To submit your answer, click A, B, C, or D, then click the Send button. You'll learn the correct answer after the question and answer session. Now, during this second topic, you learned how to view metadata on the Contents tab, you had a glimpse of XML, and you found out that you can use XML to customize the ArcCatalog Contents tab. Now let me turn the presentation over to Jason.
Thanks again. We have a question from Dawn. She asks, can I view metadata in ArcMap without opening ArcCatalog? Yes, this will be possible in 9.2. With 9.2, you will be able to do this without any use of samples. Right now, if you want that functionality, you can download a sample, and we'll see exactly where those samples are in the next segment. So watch for that. Let's see. Vince asks, can metadata be created and maintained for ArcInfo coverages? Yes, this is possible. We do support, ArcCatalog does support keeping track of metadata for those. Let's see. We have a question. John asks, on importing metadata, how do I not overwrite existing other metadata when I import? And many of you have a similar question about the behavior of the import. What import does now is it does do an override. So if you do import into anything, the metadata that was there is gone and is replaced by the thing you imported from. But we did see an example of how you can merge XML based on the FGDC contacts. The demonstration that you saw was an example of merging two XMLs, or merging data from one source into an existing XML without losing everything. So in the future, we are considering ways to do a better merge and replace of XML. So look for these at 9.2, either in the core software or as more samples and tools or scripts. Richard asks, is there a way to customize the metadata in ArcGIS 9.0? For example, can we move input items in different tabs or remove the tabs altogether that we don't want to use? So I guess we're talking about the FGDC editor here. We are not considering this kind of ability for the FGDC editor at this time, but we will be. Our plan is to extend this kind of functionality into the ISO wizard. So look for improvements in that area. Let's see, what else? Oh yes, one thing. It's some of you may have questions about the style sheet drop-down list. When I pick a different style sheet, I'm not actually changing the XML that my metadata is in. So if I do have FGDC XML, if I view it using the ISO style sheet, I'm just getting a different view of things. It's not actually changing XML behind the scenes. Okay, that's all for now. Back to Sally.
Okay, I'll take one more quick question from Nick in Denver, who asks about creating metadata. Does it have to be FGDC or ISO compliant, or can you just enter a few elements that are important to your organization? We actually recommend that you at least make it what we can refer to as minimally compliant. There are many elements, and some of which are optional, but probably the best approach is to at least make sure that you are minimally compliant on the outside chance that you might find that you need to share this information with someone ultimately outside the organization, or partly to be establishing good metadata documentation practices. All right, thank you, Jason. And let's take a look at the review question. Well, we actually have a tie between B and C, but the actual answer is that synchronization updates metadata properties with properties from the data. Well, now let's begin thinking about how you might interact with metadata in your daily work. Several of you have asked questions that have to do with things like importing that are apparently already part of your daily workflow. So what might you do during the course of a day? You might manually edit metadata using one of the editors. As some of you have indicated, you might want to work with templates to avoid some of the repetition of manual editing. You can convert data to the geodatabase and use existing metadata. And you've learned how to manage the automatic updating of metadata properties. And there may be other tasks that you do as well. Well, what if you've wondered if there were ways that you could perform some of these tasks differently, maybe differently in the sense of being more quickly than you've learned so far? For example, instead of creating a text file as your base template, might it be more convenient for you to create that file in ArcCatalog? Or maybe you find that you have several data sets that need to be updated from a single template, and you wonder whether there's a way to load the template into all of the data sets at once. Or your organization might have several people who serve as points of contact, and you'd like to store that information in a database so you can extract it whenever you edit the metadata. In the previous topic, I showed you how to create an empty XML template using a text editor. But if you're already working in ArcCatalog, it might be easier to create your empty template files there. But as you can see in this illustration of the default context menus, there is no way to create a new XML file. It doesn't show up in the list. But what if you could add that option? It's possible to do that. You can add the functionality to ArcCatalog and then add the button to the context menu. Then with each click of the button, you can add a new XML document so that it shows up in the catalog tree, and once you've done that, you can give the document a meaningful name, and then you can use one of the metadata editors to input your metadata, just as I showed in the demonstration. Well, what about that situation where you have several data sets to update? If much of the metadata, such as the abstract, the theme codes, maybe some of the keywords, is all the same for all of the data sets, consider importing from that template. And to help you work more efficiently, you can import to all of the data sets at the same time. Here you see the dialog for a batch importer that you can add to ArcCatalog. It allows you to import the same template to all of these selected feature class. And this batch importer even includes instructions at the top to help you get started. You choose the feature classes you want to update, select the file type of your template, browse to the location of the template, and once you've done that, you're ready to import. When the process has completed, a dialog pops up to confirm the data sets that were updated. Now you just saw one tool that can be a real time saver. Are there any others? Here you see some contact information for the FGDC metadata reference section. And this is very similar. This actually is identical to the contact information we saw earlier that we added to the Contents tab. Now both the FGDC editor and the ISO editor offer multiple places where you can enter this contact information, such as the metadata author, point of contact, and person responsible for distribution of the data. What if you could store this information in a database, then import it whenever you needed it? The ISO wizard already offers a built-in database that does this. But wouldn't it be nice if there was an equivalent for those of you who are using the FGDC standard and editor? With the tool, or actually the dialog from the tool that you see here, you can add the same convenience for FGDC metadata. This particular tool acts somewhat like the import tool you use for importing template files, except in this case the format is custom and for the database. You navigate to the database where you've stored your contact information, and then a dialog prompts you to choose one of the names, and this is the name within your organization, and select where within the metadata you want to place the information. And in the example shown here, the metadata for contact information will be stored in the FGDC metadata reference section. Now, as you've probably deduced, we've moved beyond the default ArcCatalog interface, and I've been showing you samples from ESRI. Why would you want to use these samples? Well, they were written by the developers here at ESRI specifically to help you in your daily work, and you can add them to ArcCatalog. You don't need to be a programmer to use the tools. You can use them even without fully understanding what's going on behind the scenes, although you might want to explore that further when you're ready. You can also learn by doing. Just read the instructions to find out what the sample does, then run it. You'll even find that you'll be able to make simple modifications to some of these samples to customize them to do more exactly what you want. And what exactly do these samples do? Well, they're designed to streamline or automate GIS-related tasks. You just had a glimpse at 3 of these samples and found out that they do a variety of tasks related to working with metadata. Now here's a list of the samples that you'll find in the help. A check mark indicates the samples that we just talked about, and you can see that there are many others for you to explore on your own. Notice the icons. The books just tell you that you're in the help, but you also see some light bulbs and some wrenches. These icons divide the samples into 2 categories: tips and tools. Tips are symbolized with a light bulb, and tools are symbolized with a wrench. Regardless of the type, the samples all come with documentation that describes what the sample does. There are instructions for how to set up the sample and use it. Tips are small code examples that run in Visual Basic for Applications, or VBA, that installs with ArcGIS. And an easy way to get started with these samples is just to copy the code from the help, then paste it into the VB editor and run it. Tools, on the other hand, are more complete examples, and they come in the form of DLLs. You can download them, and yes, I'll admit it does take a few more steps to set them up than it does for the VBA samples, but the instructions take you through the process. And after you've done this a couple of times, you'll be a pro. Now think back a few moments to the first sample we discussed, creating an XML file. Now, depending on how you access the samples, you'll find something like this: a description of the sample, perhaps an optional note from the author of the sample, and right up front, a list of the required software that you need in order to run the sample. So in this case, all you need is ArcGIS Desktop 9. In the upper right corner, you see the tip icon, so you can quickly identify this sample type. Now, as you see here for a tool, indicated by the tool icon, the format is the same as far as giving you information. Here's a description of what the sample does, as well as a list of required software. In this case, you'd need to double check and make sure that you have an extra file on disk. How can you go about finding these samples? Well, there are several ways that will get you to exactly the same information. From ArcCatalog, you can access the ArcGIS Desktop Help, scroll to the very bottom to Help for Developers, and then follow the links. or go to the ESRI Online Support Center, where the For Developers tab will take you to the ESRI Developer Network, where you'll find the Code Exchange. That's the repository for these samples. Or if you've installed the ArcGIS Developer Kit, you'll already have the samples. Be aware, though, that the online resources are dynamic and may contain samples that were created after the release of the software. In the demonstration, I'll show you one way to find these samples. So in our third demonstration, I'm going to take you to one of the samples, and I'm going to begin by opening the ESRI Developer Network, edn.esri.com. This is a relatively new website that ESRI has established for developers or anyone who uses code or wants to use or share code. Let me scroll down so that I can access the Code Exchange, and from this point I want to view other samples. Let me scroll down once more so I can search. Now that I'm in the samples, I'll change the category to metadata. I want to search the samples, and after the refresh, I'll scroll down. Notice that there are several samples here, all related to metadata, and I'm interested in the FGDC Contact Database Importer. At the top, we see the description, and one important item is that it is intended to be used within ArcCatalog. That's important for me to know. It provides an access database that can be used to record contact information. Looks like I need to do some updating. Let me scroll down a little bit so we can look at the list of products, and it tells me that everything I need is installed with ArcGIS 9, so I'm set to go. And there is some additional information on how to use it. Now, in the interest of saving time, I've already done this, but at the end of this presentation, I'll give you information where you can find more about working with DLLs. Here's a list of the files that will be installed and the opportunity to download. Again, in the interest of saving time, I've already downloaded the file. It comes in the format of a zip file, which I have unzipped. These are the files that are now in my folder, and this is the contact database. Let me go ahead and open that, and once it's opened, I can begin to enter the names of some of my same people or people who work for the company who are responsible for data or metadata. So let me just enter a few fields here. Let me resize this window a little bit and go to the bottom so I can click the right arrow for another entry, and I'll just put in a second name so we'll be able to choose between them when the time comes. And I'll save and go ahead and exit the database. Let me return now to ArcCatalog. Let me get rid of that window and bring up ArcCatalog, and I'll go to the points of interest data set that we've looked at earlier, and let me scroll down to the distribution information section where I see that there's nothing there. Let me import the database importer. I want to navigate to where it's located on disk and enter it. I'll click OK, and now I need to choose one. I'll do the distribution, and when I click OK and now go down to the distribution information section, I see the name. This concludes our final demonstration, and let's have a quick review here. We introduced ways to work more efficiently with metadata, and we looked at some tips and tools for using within ArcCatalog. Let me turn over to Jason for maybe one or two more quick questions.
Thank you. Yes, we just have time for a couple more questions. Alan asks, can I apply my own custom style sheets to ArcCatalog's metadata view? Yes, you can. Those style sheets are in the, if you follow ArcGIS, ArcCatalog, and metadata folder where ArcGIS is installed, there you will see those style sheets that appear in the drop-down list. And you can examine those files and take a look at that XSLT, and you can drop in your file there and close ArcCatalog, bring it back up, and your own style sheet should appear if you follow the same form as the others are in. John asks, can I use the batch importer for metadata records that are not associated with a feature class? Yes, the batch importer will import into any object that ArcGIS knows supports metadata, and that should include standalone XML files. And just one more. When will the development of ISO standard be complete? ISO 19139 is complete, and it should be an international standard by the end of the year. So expect at 9.2 support in ArcGIS for that brand new ISO schema. And again, if you have any other questions, please look to the samples. Look to the samples. There you will find a lot of helpful bits of code and information to get you going. And back to Sally. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Looks like we are running out of time. If you're just getting started with metadata, consider taking the virtual campus course Creating and Maintaining Metadata using ArcGIS Desktop. The course Customizing ArcGIS 9 will step you through the process of adding VBA and DLL samples to ArcGIS, and the Using ArcCatalog manual that comes with the software contains a metadata tutorial. Additional resources will also be available on the What's Next page of the recorded seminar. On behalf of ESRI, I'd like to thank you all for attending.